It's a pleasure to introduce Jordan Bowling today, who's going to be giving us grand rounds. It's a rite of passage for every chief resident to have grand rounds before they graduate, but that doesn't mean that their chief residency is over after they give their grand rounds. Anyway, Jordan calls Nebraska home, where he grew up in a very close-knit extended family. So close-knit that he still gets care boxes from Nebraska every so often with a whole bunch of home-baked goodies. I'm not sure how many of you guys have been party to this home-baked, to this box of cookies every so often, especially at this time of the year. It's coming next week. Good. Anyway, Jordan moved out east for his undergraduate studies and went to Amherst College, where he graduated with honors and majored in religion. Looking for some sun after getting tired of being out east, he moved to Hawaii for a break, where he pursued his other interests like music, diving, the beach. While I asked him, how did you support yourself? He said he did construction and various sundry jobs. After 2 years, he grew tired of the sand and the surf, and he moved back to the mainland to pursue his real passion, which is medicine, at Howard University College of Medicine, where he was a Howard Trustee Scholar. At Howard, Jordan continued his academic excellence, was the recipient of the Latman and MedStar among many awards during his tenure there. He graduated with honors at graduation, and then he was elected to the Alpha Omega Alpha. But all this while immersing himself in the community where he was. He ran a student-run health clinic and was very active in the community, mentoring underprivileged kids. It is this experience with kids which really sort of fueled his passion for pediatrics. And lucky for us, he decided to go the pediatric surgery route, so we were able to recruit him. Jordan joined our program 7 years ago. 2 of those years he spent at the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, where he worked and did research on gut colonization, specifically in an animal model for neck, under the mentorship and tutelage of Henry Ford, who we all know is a real leader and pioneer in the field of pediatric surgery. He was very, very prolific there, published extensively, chapters, peer-reviewed publications, as well as presented in many national presentations. However, aside from his accomplishments, what really stands out when you know Jordan and get a chance to talk to him is really his insight and his sort of sense of social responsibility, which is evident in all the activities that he's done while in college, in medical school, and even here. What struck me as impressive is that even now, as a resident, in the midst of the grueling demands of his residency, he still remains very active in youth organizations, specifically the national organization called Break the Cycle, where he works with at-risk youths, trying to work with them to achieve their academic goals. So it's sort of very interesting, and I've had a lot of conversations with Jordan, and it's funny how you remember certain things very vividly. You know what you're doing when significant things happen in your life, and this happened about a year and a week ago, and to me it was significant. It was called election night, and I knew exactly what I was doing then. I was doing an appendectomy with Jordan while the electoral college votes were coming in. And we had a lot of conversation, and one of the concerns, obviously, was what was the future with someone coming into power who had very little sense of unity and tolerance. And I think the conversation has continued, and I'd like today Jordan He's going to talk about his thoughts on racism and how it has evolved in our profession. Will you please join me in welcoming Jordan?
Thank you for that introduction. It's definitely more generous than I probably deserve. As I upload this PowerPoint, I'll kind of talk about what I'm going to go into today. And as Dr. Davino said, I really hold importance in not only work here, but also how it affects people in everyday life and essentially the interplay of all these things. And how, for me, being how I was made, how race comes into play. So we'll get into it. I have no disclosures, of course. I'm broke like every other resident that there is. So in terms of how we're going to do it, my outline is I'm going to talk about my connection to the topic, a little background about myself, and then how my interest grew in this topic. After that, I'm going to go through a few historical examples of how racism evolved throughout medicine and how it was a intricate part, the beginning of medicine in America. And after that, I'll talk about one study that just relates to racism in medicine today in terms of medical professionals and how we have implicit or explicit bias in terms of race. And then lastly, I'll talk about maybe some ways we can create change. And I purposefully made this presentation short because I find that when you discuss these topics, if you have too much information or you overanalyze things, that sometimes people can either drown out and go to sleep, or you don't give them enough time to digest and process the information and handle it in a manner that they see fit. So I will leave a lot of, hopefully, time to discuss, ask questions, and even afterwards, if you would like to have a conversation one-on-one or in a group, I'd be more than happy to. As everyone knows, I'm pretty easygoing and I like to talk with people. That being said, as Dr. Davino alluded to, I come from Nebraska. It's this state that's kind of in the middle of nowhere. I always get 3 questions about Nebraska, being usually the first person that anyone's ever met from Nebraska. First is, where is Nebraska? As you can kind of say, it's in the heartland, quote unquote, of America. Some also call it the Bible Belt, whatnot. So it's a red state. It's definitely red in terms of color, in terms of sports, and then also in terms of the way it leans politically. I like one, not so much the other. The second question I always get is, did you grow up on a farm? Farming is a huge part of Nebraska. It's its major way it makes money, often corn and soybeans. But no, I actually grew up in the capital, Lincoln, Nebraska, which could be thought of as in a college town, a football town. It's also known for Omaha steaks, which I really, really love. I know everyone out here likes to go to Fogo de Chao and spend oodles of money, but I think a good Omaha steak is the best one you can get. And of course, being from Nebraska, unfortunately, we like red meat a lot. And then last but not least, it's known for football. As of late, they haven't been doing too well. I'm sure some Giants fans in here can probably relate in terms of record, unfortunately, for both of us. But I love Nebraska football. I'm proud of it. My brother actually played for them. He got an athletic scholarship and played for them for 4 years. So it was really awesome watching him play and be successful on the field and then even off the field as well. In terms of my family background, as Dr. Vina also alluded to, I have a really, really big family. I only have one brother, but I have a ton of first cousins that are essentially all within 5 years of my age. You look over on the left of the screen, this is on my mom's side. This is on a Christmas that unfortunately I was not able to go home to. This is my brother's house, and they're all celebrating Christmas. And so on this side, my background would be German and English on my mother's side. And on my father's side, you can see that it's a very diverse group. My father is one of 8, and essentially everyone married somebody of a different race as they grew up. So I have cousins that are part Chinese as well as Puerto Rican and Irish. And so I take real pride in the diversity that I grew up with. And And it wasn't that we didn't see color when I was growing up. We knew what color was. It just was no hierarchical value. And I will also go into a story how I first learned about this and how it got me interested in medicine and in terms of race. This all happened within the same year. Here are my parents. You can see my dad in the middle on the left, and that's my nephew, Walker Jordan, there. We are at one of my cousin's weddings. And then over here on the right, you can see my mom and with my brother and his family over at my grandparents celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. And speaking of my grandparents, these are them at my med school graduation. You can see my grandparents on the left. That's my grandma Bev and my grandpa Bob, also known as Barber Bob, who still cuts hair at the VA even after he retired from his owning 2 barbershops in Lincoln. And then on the left, you have Bernice and Obasi Onaha, my late grandfather on the right, and is also a very, very hard worker, and both of them continued to work until my grandfather, who just passed away, only retired from one job. That's all he wanted to do, so that's when we threw him his retirement party. But how these 2 sets of grandparents come into play and how race comes into play at the same time was when I was approximately 6 years old. It was bring your parents to work day. And I didn't want to just to school day. And I didn't want to just bring my parents, I brought my grandparents as well, because I was uber excited. So I'm sitting in the class, it's my turn, I'm talking about my dad, he's teaches public school, vocal music. My mom has her own small business, and she does like wallpapering, and she lets me help out in the summer. And then my grandparents, my grandpa Bob was a barber, and my grandma was actually one of the first nurses on the first cardiothoracic team in Nebraska before she retired and decided to stay at home and take care of the kids. My grandfather on the right, who's an engineer for Burlington Northern, after he graduated college, he was supposed to go back to Nigeria, but he met my grandmother, and that was that. He's decided to stay. And then my grandma, who was a teacher and an avid participant in the civil rights movement in Nebraska. And as I get done finishing, everyone's looking, they're kind of twisting their head, and one kid raises his hand and he says, your mom and her parents are white, and your dad and his parents are black. And I sat there and I was perplexed. I was like, what is he talking about? And of course, my response was a little bit, weird to them. I said, no, my mom, her parents are like peach or pink, and my dad is like brown. And so that night was the first time I remember actually having a conversation with my parents and my grandparents, who have been nothing but supportive the whole time, but that's the first time we had a conversation about race in terms of what white and black meant and the hierarchical value that's associated with being white or being black. And also that year, later on, I don't have a picture of him, but it was my first time remembering when I wanted to be a doctor. So I go to the doctor's office with my brother. We sit down because he has a wart on his finger, and this gentleman walks in his pretty white coat. It looked kind of like my grandpa Bob, actually, and he has this styrofoam cup in his hand, and there's this steam coming out of it. And he takes a Q-tip and he dips it in there, and then he touches my brother's finger, and he does it a few times, and poof, the wart is gone. And that was really cool. So I was, sitting there with my jaw open. But then he said, watch this, and he took the contents of the cup and he threw it on the ground. And this steam rose from the ground. He said, touch it. And I touched it, and it was cold. And I thought this was magic. He was using liquid nitrogen, of course. But from that point on, I knew I wanted to be a doctor. And so those 2 stories happened at the same time, and it kind of helped mold me into who I wanted to become and the struggles that I dealt with along the way in grade school, middle school, high school, saying that I shouldn't be a doctor. I didn't fit the typical bill of being a doctor. And honestly, that was hard to overcome. At certain points, I didn't think I was going to, because I didn't see a lot of doctors that looked like me when I was growing up. In fact, I didn't see any. But eventually, as Dr. Davino also said, I got to Amherst College, and this leads me to my first historical example of racism in medicine. Smallpox and Jeffrey Amherst. So Jeffrey Amherst was born in England in the 1700s, and he joined the British Army in about 1735. He quickly rose through the ranks, and he's best known for essentially winning the 7 Years' Wars that took place in New France, which is now known as Quebec. He was Major General by 1760, but in 1763, during this war, there was an agreement after some of the battles that the 6 Native American nations with the British and French, that there was essentially a treaty and that all the people of the British and French were to remain east of the Allegheny Mountains. However, like most treaties that were ever formed, were broken, and so the tribes revolted, and this was not honored after it wasn't honored. And so there were letters between General Jeffrey Amherst and his Colonel Bouquet, and this is essentially denotes the first instance in kind of the Americas of biological warfare. And what he did was he talked about how can we inoculate essentially the native population, because he knew they were susceptible to diseases after the people from the quote-unquote West came. And so these are the actual quotes from the letters that happened. He said, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disaffected tribes of the Indians? We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." To which he was replied by his general, "I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall in their hands, taking care, however, not to get the disease myself. As it is a pity to oppose good men against them, I wish we could make use of the Spaniards' method and hunt them with English dogs, supported by rangers and some light horse, who would think effectively extirpate or remove that vermin." And then finally, Jeffrey Amherst responds, "You would do well to try to inoculate the Indians by the means of blankets, as well as try to every other method that you can serve to extirpate and this excurable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them down by dogs could take effect, but England is at too great a distance to think of that at present." And so this is the first instance, essentially, biological warfare in North America, and this was verified by Ms. Finn later on, that there was a trader who got the blankets from the hospital, who gave them to the Native Americans at that time, and then roughly after that, he had an outbreak of smallpox. I didn't find this out until I went to Amherst and I wanted to research about him, and when I found this out, it completely baffled me that this happened, and later that somebody would be honored after this. But you'll see this in other instances as we go on, that this is a normalcy. Luckily now, this is what Amherst College used to be, Lord Jeffs. That's what we used to be. I remember when I went there, that was the mascot. But even before I got there, and finally after I left, there was a great debate about should this still be the mascot. And actually, within the last year, this has now changed. And through a vote of the administrators to the staff and students, that it's now the Amherst Mammoths instead of the Jeffrey Amherst. It doesn't mean that he's still not a part of the institution. It just means that they didn't feel it was necessary to honor him anymore. The next one is essentially kind of the father of medicine and its relationship with racism within medical schools. This is Benjamin Rush, and he actually saw blackness as a disease. He was one of the founding fathers of America, believe it or not, and he taught racial difference as part of the curriculum at the University of Pennsylvania in the 1790s. And he thought being black was actually a form of hereditary leprosy that would eventually be cured. And so he was actually an abolitionist, believe it or not. He thought that we should have pity on African Americans at that time, and that they should be met with the quote-unquote utmost humanity, but he didn't think they were equals, and he thought ultimately the goal would be to cure them, that such America would be all white. And you can see this as one of his quotes is, "Whites should not tyrannize over blacks, for their disease should entitle them to a double portion of humanity. However, by the same token, whites should not intermarry with them, for this would tend to infect prosperity with the disorder. Attempts must be made to cure the disease." So you see this kind of dichotomy or this interplay between racism and slavery. Some people that, even though were racist, didn't believe in slavery, were actually abolitionists, but they didn't see them as equal. And others used science, as we'll get into further examples, to justify racism and the hierarchy that led to slavery. phrenology. Does anybody know what phrenology is, or has anybody heard of it before? A lot of you. So it's kind of it's a pseudoscience, and it was developed by a German physician, Franz Joseph Gall, in 1796. And essentially, it's by using the shape of a skull that you can tell the characteristics of a person. So the brain wasn't thought as one organ, was thought as multiple organs, and each corresponded to essentially a different trait or ability. And by looking at the shape of the skull, you could essentially tell how a person would interact with the world. And I have this picture on the top right. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Django. There's a really good scene, actually, where Leonardo DiCaprio talks about comparing one of his slaves to Django, who is essentially thought to be a very smart but still black. And he's trying to essentially say that they're the same. The movie itself, I'm not sure if I like it yet or not to this day, but the scene sheds light on phrenology, and it's a pretty remarkable scene. And so the last one says the human skull is shaped, and that's because of the brain. So the skull is what shapes the brain, and thus the study of the shape, size, and geography of the human skull can yield information about these organs and the mental capacity of a person to whom it belonged. So again, this started way in Germany, but through students going over across seas, or once it branched to America, it kind of took a different form, and it was actually used to justify slavery and even westward expansion. Two examples of that, during the 1830s and 40s, essentially right before the Civil War, kind of the height of slavery, you have Charles Caldwell, who was a founder of he was a founder of the University of Louisville, but he went to Pennsylvania University for medical school, and he studied the skulls of Africans while at the Museum of Phrenology in Paris. And so after his extensive studies, he alluded to that African skulls demonstrated tameableness, and that made Africans and people of that origin suitable to be slaves and required them to have a master. And then it was the rightful place to be slaves. Before phrenology and these other instances, slavery was usually justified by demographics, or where they came from, either being that they were thought to be living in huts and those kind of notions, and or religion. Christianity was used to often justify slavery, but now, as we get later into this time frame, you see science being used to back up the notion of slavery. And then Samuel Morton, who created a book, an extensive book called Crania Americana, who was the founder of Pennsylvania Medical College, also detailed the configurations and consequential mental capacities of what he thought to be 5 separate species. So therefore, he thought that people of African origin were a completely different species, and therefore less as human. And he also studied white skulls and Native American skulls, and he tried to do this in an objective manner. Not only did he measure skulls, he measured how much depth they had and the amount of brain they could hold. And essentially, you can see one of his sketches on the right. I encourage you, you can actually Google this book and rummage through its pages. It's interesting and scary at the same time. And as you can see, he tries to show that there's a hierarchy, and those of European origin are at the top, and those of African ancestry are towards the bottom and closest to those of such as apes. And so he also came up with this notion that Native Americans were adverse to cultivation, aka they were savages, and slow in acquiring knowledge. And so this was actually used by Andrew Jackson during his Indo-Indian removal policies, and actually used to justify westward expansion. And both of these gentlemen here were actually proteges of Dr. Rush. And so you can see how these ideas, even if they're different types of science, that these notions were passed down from one physician to another and solidified within the societal structure. Another one is a drapetomania. This is a notion by Samuel Cartwright. He also studied under Dr. Rush at UPenn, And his premier type of medicine was actually psychological disorders, not so much the maladies of the physical. But this drapetomania is actually essentially translates to a love for running away. So this is what he used to explain and kind of show that certain slaves were more predisposed to running away, or runaway slaves, and he thought it was a consequence due to masters who have made themselves too familiar with slaves or too kind to slaves. And so he's often prescribed that they needed to be whipped a certain amount of times, or other forms of punishments were actually medical therapy to kind of hinder slaves from trying to run away. I'm sure many of you know about James Marion Sims. I actually didn't learn about him until I got to New York, and I was walking through Central Park, and there's a statue of him still up in Central Park. Actually, and you can see here, this was actually recently, someone vandalized it, defaced it within the last year. It's on the corner on 5th Avenue and 103rd. You can look at it, but this is probably one of the most gruesome instances of I guess medical malpractice, you could say, during this time. So he performed surgeries on a total of 12 enslaved women who suffered vesicovaginal fistulas and rectovaginal fistulas during childbirth. And he did all of these for a period of 4 years, all without anesthesia. One undergoing a total of 13 surgeries, and actually by some accounts she might have went up to 30 surgeries. The slaves were forced to restrain each other during the procedure, as other physicians that tried to help out with him in the beginning really couldn't stand the pain that the women went through and the screams. And actually he did, however, give them morphine, but it was only after the surgery, and many people think it is due to that he essentially created a dependence in the slaves, such that it was their reward after going through the procedure. He did, however, perfect it and did relatively well. The hindrance he had at first was due to the suture that he used and it continually being contaminated. So he switched to a silver suture that he designed, and it actually helped protect against infection. And once he perfected that, he moved to New York in 1853, and he actually founded a women's hospital that eventually merged with St. Luke's, and he continued to perform the surgery. However, he eventually started using anesthesia when he was doing it in the new demographic. His reasoning for not using anesthesia was that he felt that the procedure wasn't painful enough, and also he had a belief that slaves had a higher sense of pain tolerance, or couldn't feel pain as much as Caucasians, due to, again, their lineage. And as we move through history, even after these notions of phrenology and such were debunked, we still have history of extreme instances of racism in medicine that permeate through our history. Again, one of the major cases I'm sure that everybody knows about is the Tuskegee experiment. Just a little background on Tuskegee. It's a small community just east of Montgomery, Alabama. Has roughly about 9,000 people. One of its main notoriety is Booker T. Washington, who founded the Tuskegee Institute, who then turned into Tuskegee University. And one of their premier scientists was George Washington Carver, who I'm pretty fond of, not just because he loves peanuts, and I do love peanut butter, I do, trust me, I do, but also he examined kind of a different interplay that I'm also very interested in. It's the interplay between religion and medicine, and how he didn't feel that there had to be a dichotomy or a fight between the two. Also of note, Tuskegee, the Tuskegee Airmen, which was the first squadron of African-American pilots that were trained in the U.S. military that actually entered combat. Before that, usually African Americans that were in the U.S. military or on cleanup duty or cooking duty, and even after World War II, these gentlemen faced extraordinary amounts of racism when they came back, especially to the South. But in terms of the Tuskegee experiment, this happened for over a period of 40 years. I mean, my brother was almost born by the time this ended. So these notions of racism and medicine are not completely out of date. So it was conducted by the government, U.S. Public Health Services, and the purpose of the study was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in rural African American men in Alabama under the guise of receiving free health care from the United States government. So there was a total of 600 men, and approximately 400 of them that had known syphilis, and 200 of them that didn't, but were still observed as essentially case controls. And for their enrollment, which was supposed to only last 6 months, they were given free medical care, meals, and burial insurance in case they were to succumb to the disease. In 1947, this is about 15 years after this study was initiated, penicillin had become the standard for treatment in syphilis. However, they say it's due to how funding was lost. The study continued, and treatment wasn't offered to these gentlemen, and they continued to be observed year after year under the guise of they were being treated for bad blood. It's just a term that these gentlemen didn't know any better. They're often from sharecropping and undereducated community, and so they thought they were being adequately treated. So none of these patients were actually ever told that they had syphilis, and none of them were ever treated with penicillin during this approximately 40-year period. The effects were numerous. Hundreds of these men died, and actually 40 of the wives contracted the disease, and due to that, 19 children were born with congenital syphilis during this time frame. The end of it. So you have, first, you would think that somebody would speak out and it would just end right there. Unfortunately, it didn't happen as such. It continued all the way until the 70s, even after the first instance. It almost took 10 years for this to actually come to fruition and cease. So Dr. Irwin Schatz, who was just a new physician, he was a physician in Chicago that actually read about this, because this research was published, read it in a medical journal, and he wrote a letter to the journals essentially saying how this was unethical. He was completely ignored, didn't even receive a reply. Dr. Peter Buxton, he's one of the, if not the major component in terms of how this study was ended. He was a PHS investigator, and he sent a letter to the National Director of the Division of the Venereal Diseases of the CDC, and the CDC reaffirmed the need to complete the study with the backing of the AMA and the NMA. NMA, if you know, is one of the premier minority medical associations, and even in this experiment, minority physicians helped to participate and continue it. Dr. William Carter Jenkins, he was a statistician, and he actually started a journal called The Drum, in which he hoped that he could fight racism within the PHS and the CDC where he worked, because it was rampant even among healthcare workers there. And he wrote an article trying to call for the end of the study. However, the Drum didn't reach prominent crowd, and so it never helped. And that wasn't until 4 years after that Dr. Buxton essentially said he had enough. He went to the press in Washington, D.C., where it was posted first, and then the next day it was actually posted in the New York Times, and then it kind of went all downhill from there, and it led to a hearing and the closing of the Tuskegee experiment. In terms of the aftermath, Congress passed the National Research Act in 1974, which led to the creation of the National Commission for Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavior Research. Essentially, ethics were reviewed quite heavily in this country, not only for minorities, but in terms of prison inmates, which I didn't allude to in this presentation, but it's heavily coincides with experimentation of those of minority and poor populations. And this also, 1975 through 77, they made reports and recommendations on regards to what to do in terms of research for these populations. And then finally, it led to the Belmont Report, which essentially created three important points in terms of research. You must have respect for the persons that you're doing. You have to explain everything, and you have to get informed consent. And you can lie or withhold information from the patients, such as they did during the Tuskegee experiment. And then benefits. Essentially, that's what we are supposed to do in medicine, first and foremost, do no harm. We fell short of it for quite some time, but this helped to change it and maximize the benefits for research. And then lastly, justice. Ensuring that the research that you do is reasonable and not putting a patient in dire conditions just to get results. And then finally, and then Tuskegee, after the Tuskegee experiment, it wasn't until 1997 that there was a public apology, essentially a national apology on behalf of the country from Bill Clinton to this population that underwent this type of abuse. 5 of the 8 remaining survivors attended. And I forgot to say, shortly after the Tuskegee experiment, there was some type of reconciliation of all of the participants received approximately $9 million to divide up between them, and then they were given free health care for the rest of their life as well. But these points I will get to, I will show how this matters. What Bill Clinton did matters in terms of bridging that gap between what has happened and trying to prevent it from happening again. And so what he says is, what's done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. To our African American citizens, I am sorry that your federal government orchestrated a study so clearly racist. So in terms of racism in medicine today, I just want to talk about one study that recently came out. It's a systematic review of the extent of racism and how we can measure it within healthcare itself. How healthcare providers, do we have bias, and does that play into how we treat patients? And so, in essence, there was about 9,000 results initially, and that dwindled down to 37 upon extensive review that could be included in the study, which was done between the period of 1995 and 2012. And essentially, the results from this are not unexpected, but still nonetheless a little bit shocking, that 2/3 out of the study found significant evidence of racism. And they did this by looking at implicit and explicit bias, and this is done most often than not through surveys or types of tests like the implicit association test. And of the studies that use the implicit association test, all of them found that racism played a factor in healthcare. That being that physicians and nurses and other hospital personnel have a baseline amount of prejudice and racism. And direct testing showed that racism in 4 studies, while bias was not found in 2 studies. And then of the 5 studies that used direct and indirect testing, all of them found that racism played a significant role. However, these studies are limited, given that there's a paucity of research and that they are cross-sectional. It's kind of hard to do a prospective trial in terms of racism, obviously. sample size or response rate. A lot of people are kind of unwilling to participate in these types of research. And then lastly, controlling for other confounders, such as gender, which I will also get into later. However, this does show that there's good evidence, or the best evidence that we can get, that racism also is still in the medical community. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just there, just like other types of bias that we have. And so in terms of challenging racism today, I think first and foremost is recognition. We have to recognize the historical context and how it started and how it still kind of permeates through the medical field within our community as a whole. I think that's very important that we recognize that. And then we have to admit our bias and our prejudice. Every single person has bias and prejudice, and that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. But to actually tackle the issue or to try and change something, we have to first admit that it exists. That's essentially, I think, one of the main points that we have to be able to do. It's hard. It's very hard to admit that you're biased or that you have some baseline prejudice. And then we have to be able to have discourse. We have to be able to talk about it. And I think, given that we are in the medical community, we can do that hopefully a little bit with more ease in terms of having a discourse with intelligence and respect. And then second, reconciliation. After we recognize these issues, there has to be some form of reconciliation. I'm not saying it has to be a complete admission of guilt or anything, but we have to realize that these things had a significant role in the way we live today, and we have to try bring change to that. I think a lot of times we try to downplay it or whitewash things that have happened in history and try and kind of take down the significance of what it did at that time and how it still permeates through our society. And then last, I think we need to create methods where bias can be addressed in a constructive manner, such as forums, discussions, in such a way that people don't feel threatened or feel that they're going to be bombarded because they have a different viewpoint. Lastly, I think representation is of the utmost importance. I actually had another opportunity. This is a couple of days ago after work. I was able to go to public school in Brooklyn and mentor some kids. And often when I do this, it baffles my mind that none of them think that medicine is a possibility for them. It's not even a realization. I mean, it doesn't even cross their mind for some of these kids. And I mean, they're absolutely brilliant. And then it breaks my heart to see this. So when I get to go there and they start asking questions that are some questions that I've never heard before, that are amazing questions, and they show actual interest in medicine, it really shows me that representation is important. And this happened to me as a kid. I didn't see someone who looked like me practicing medicine, and almost it deterred me from going into it. And luckily, I went to Howard, and I saw people that looked like me performing medicine and doing great, and it essentially lit the fire again. So I think representation is absolutely key, not only for children, but for us and the medical professional. So I think it's necessary to create an environment of diversity, of appearance and ideas. So not only should we look different, or we should also have different ideas. And obviously some of them won't agree with each other, and that's the beauty of it. If you only talk to somebody who agrees with everything you say all the time, you're not going to learn much. I think another goal is to actively recruit minorities at all levels of medicine. That's one of the reasons I came to Mount Sinai, and I commend Dr. Davino for making such a great effort in terms of diversity, not only with race, but with other aspects too. And I think that's really important, and now I'm starting to see it within the attendings. Before I left for research, there was nobody really that represented the African diaspora here, and now we have 2 attendings that I look up to and I've talked to and I really respect. And it, again, it lights the fire and makes you want to keep going and keep pursuing. And then lastly, I think building programs that encourage youth to pursue a career in medicine, as I alluded to, it doesn't even cross their mind for a lot of these kids, the thought of doing anything in medicine or science. And then last but not least, I think we have to always think about intersectionality. So race is only one issue in terms of disadvantages within the medical community and patients. Discrimination is compounded when you add other forms of prejudice. So for somebody who's a minority, other factors that come into play is class and gender. Studies have shown that it's exponentially harder for women of color in professional fields. And then we factor in religion, people from the LGBTQ community and disabilities. So I think overall, race is only one issue. It's an important issue, but at the end of the day, we have to think of ways that we can recognize our biases and prejudices and how to be able to constructively deal with them to help prevent them from us treating patients and our fellow colleagues. That's it, if anyone has any questions. Yes, sir. Dr. Vine. Thank you.
You have an opinion, and we all know the saying that those who ask are due here. I know that they're planning on taking down the statue of Sims, it's just up the street from us. Taking down the statue of Robert E. Lee. What's your opinion on things like that?
Sure. So I think that they still have a place in history. I think that they shouldn't be hidden away, because I think in doing that, again, what you alluded to, you forget what happened. I'm a big fan of what they call, I don't know if people have ever heard of a Tytler cycle of democracy. It kind of goes through this whole notion how you overcome some obstacle and then you become complacent and then it happens again. I think removing the statues should be done in a constructive manner. I don't think they should be completely buried and destroyed. I think they should be put in places where you can go see them and recognize them, but I don't think necessarily they should be put on places of public space such as courthouses or parks. And often these constructions of those monuments like Robert E. Lee happened in two instances, two periods in time. First, directly after the Civil War and birth of the KKK, and secondly, during the Civil Rights Movement. So people who want to say that they're honoring their history, yeah, it's a little negligent, because they were put up there for a purpose often by the Daughters of the Confederacy, who also created textbooks that were rampant in the South that kind of whitewashed and downplayed the significance of racism and slavery and within the Civil War. Yes, sir.
One that, you're sort of the beacon of light, very different problem in human nature. Not look back, sort of away from horrible things happening in the country, particularly the heat study. One can think of the Nazi doctors with the same kind of experiment for years, about 20 years, and about the same time in Europe as the experiment was being done.
Absolutely.
Today, the millions of refugees are coming from the Middle East, both into Western Europe and Eastern Europe, are being overtly discriminated, and they do not have the same access to healthcare in the public system, not private, the public system,
Yeah.
as the local indigenous people.
Yeah.
And so it makes you think that the human nature
Yeah.
is
Absolutely. I try to focus this talk on North America, but these instances obviously take place globally, in Europe, Israel, some thoughts with the minority Ethiopian community, and other instances. This is not a single race issue. It's not just with only black people. This happens across the board. And then again, I think intersectionality comes into play. It happens across other demographics as well. So we have to really be cognizant of it. Yes, Dr.
Jordan, I don't really have a question. I just want to commend you for the continued persistence and distraction you have for this.
Thank you.
And keep it up, and I'm sure this is not the end. This last one here about it.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.